So this talk is a little bit about strategy, and strategy is one of my favorite topics, especially when you're in a meeting and people describe and use the word strategy, but they're not really talking about strategy. They're talking about something else. So in this presentation, what I wanted to do was give you all a little bit of an intro. Give me a sec to figure out how this works here. So let's just get started. The big picture is, what is a strategy? And actually, it's not very hard. It's really just a plan describing how you will accomplish your goals. But what's crucial is that a good strategy exploits crucial points in a situation, such that your plan allows you and your team or whatever you're working on to discover hidden power in a situation that allows you to accomplish your goals. So in this talk, I'm going to go over a few stories. I'll give you a few examples of this hidden power in situations. So my objective with this talk is to give you just enough so that you become curious and you want to learn more about strategy. And I have a resource for it at the end of it. And hopefully you become curious, you learn a little bit more about this, and you can apply some of these concepts in your life and in your careers. Cool, so let's get started. So we're going to reset our minds and we're going to go back to 1995. So for those of you that were around or had some of these things, think Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, flashy colors, baggy clothes. Probably, if I'm being honest, the best era of humankind to ever exist, I think. So people don't remember this, but at the time, Microsoft was the most successful company in the world. And it was extremely aggressive. So aggressive, in fact, at destroying competition that the United States Department of Justice brought complaints against the company and forced Gates to testify in front of the US Congress. It was pretty bad. It was so bad, in fact, that Microsoft spent 10 years defending itself against being broken up into multiple smaller companies. And so in 1995, when Windows 95 was released, it was a huge deal. So to put it into context, 99% of desktop computers at the time used Windows. And this was a global event. It was so big, in fact, that people lined up to buy Windows 95 like they were buying iPhones. It was such a big deal that the executives of Microsoft got up on stage and started dancing. That is not a meme. That's not just a meme. That's not a fake video. Those are the Microsoft executives dancing, making fools of themselves in front of everyone. It was so huge, in fact, that the industry was absolutely positive that Apple was finished. This is a picture of a magazine at the time, one of the biggest business magazines in the US. It's called Business Week. And this was the headline that they ran. This is how big of a deal this was. And it didn't stop there. Here's another picture of a magazine. This is from Wired magazine. This one probably everybody's familiar with. They wrote an article called 101 Ways to Save Apple. That's how dangerous the situation was for Apple. I'll save you the time, so you don't have to read all 101 ways to save Apple. But number one, this one's one of my favorites. It's Apple admitted you are out of the hardware game. So can you imagine? Apple, give up. You're never going to do hardware. I love that one. Number two, Apple, you should license your technology or license your brand to manufacturers. I love this one because can you imagine Apple engineers around a table sacrificing their lives, their families to build us the better Apple microwave, the best microwave that money can buy. I just love that picture. So the situation was dire. So 99% of those computers are all using Windows. And at this time, Apple only had 2 months of money left in the bank. This is pretty serious, right? This is actually what Steve Jobs had to do. This was the job that Steve had when he was invited to come back to Apple to be the CEO of the company. He was supposed to be just the CEO temporarily. This task was obviously pretty serious. It was honestly, probably impossible, right? So you're about to get crushed by your competition and you have no money. So what would Steve do? So before I go into his strategy here, put yourself in this situation. Imagine that you are, the head of your company. The competition, 99% of it is, taking up 99% of the market share. So you've got, tiny bit, and you hardly have any money left. So, I'll leave you to think about it for a second or two before I move on. All right, so here it comes. Here was the grand strategy. You probably expected more, right? Probably expected something complicated. And you know what? So did everyone else. But nope, this is the strategy. What we're going to do then is we're going to walk through the strategy, walk through the hidden powers in this plan, and I'm going to explain why a good strategy is actually pretty simple. It's simple to describe, it's simple to communicate, and it's not very complicated. I think this is probably the most surprising thing about a strategy. Number one, how do we get money? So here's something very cool. Steve Jobs convinced Microsoft to invest $150 million into Apple. This gave Apple the runway it needed to turn the company around. But how? How did they do that? Using the first hidden power. So Steve Jobs knew that Bill Gates was in danger of having his company broken up because it had no competition. If Apple died, then that would really be true. So Apple had to survive, and Steve knew this. So this is an example of an advantage. Things that are hard for one party, but easy for another party. So these are imbalances in a situation that favor one party or one thing or another. Apple had none of the US government difficulties that Microsoft had. So Steve used that to his advantage. So next time that you have to come up with a plan and you're looking for hidden power, think about these imbalances that might favor you or might favor some elements on here that you can exploit. So, all right, step one done. We got money. That was easy. How do we keep the money? Another thing that people forget is that at the time, Apple made all sorts of ugly, unprofitable shit. Apple's CEO at the time called these items, this ugly shit on the screen, he called them data appliances. Data appliances. Here's my favorite thing about this name, data appliances. Compare that to Steve Jobs' description of the of the iPod. 1,000 songs in your pocket. Or compare that to Steve's description of the computer, a bicycle for the mind. All of that needs to be canceled. So Steve got rid of these data appliances, got rid of the printer, got rid of the cameras, got rid of these handheld devices. Even the CEO was canceled. So this was the previous CEO that, remember, Steve was brought in temporarily as a board member, and then he got rid of the CEO. That was very dramatic too. It didn't stop there. Steve reduced the number of desktop models from 15 down to 1. My favorite little tidbit about this is that Steve had left Apple. His family members wanted to buy a new computer, and they went up to Steve and said, "Hey, Steve, we want a new computer for our family. Which one of these computers do you recommend?" Steve did the research and he replied to his own family, "I have no idea. There's 15 different computers and I can't tell what's what." Got rid of all the peripherals, no more cameras. got rid of the handheld devices, unfortunately, fired most of the software developers, halted progress on most of the software projects, reduced the number of people that sold Apple products just to one. So previously, these distributors wanted all sorts of price points and all sorts of features, and that made Apple products very expensive and very shitty. So he cut all of those. And then finally moved US manufacturing to Taiwan. They were left with a product line that we might recognize today. So at the time, there was the Power G3 desktop, so down from 15 different desktops down to just this one. And that ugly little black laptop there on the right-hand side, I forget what its name is. I think it's a PowerBook or something. Pretty simple. So this is hidden power number 2. Apple focused on a market segment, Apple fanboys, I'm one of them, creative types like artists, producers, musicians, bohemians, a segment that Apple could serve and could serve better than others, better than other companies. He cut Apple back down to a core that could survive and still delight its customers. So we keep the money, great, by cutting all the unprofitable stuff. What's crucial about this is that he cut Apple down to a sustainable core, right? Something that could survive, something that was more simple. So at this point, Apple is safe. It's not going to go bankrupt. But how does it win against Microsoft? Remember, we're talking about the PC industry here at the time. This is one of my favorite quotes ever in life. This quote, or this question here, was a question that a young journalist, a young professor at the time, asked Steve Jobs in his office in 1997, in the summer of 1997. And I'll go ahead and read it because it is important, although I know you can read it yourself, but it reads, "Steve, this turnaround has been impressive, but Apple can't push past its niche position. Wintel, the combination of Windows machines and Intel chips, is too strong. What is the strategy?" So what follows here is one of my favorite quotes. Steve replied very simply, "I'm waiting for the next big thing." Seems incomplete, right? But what's interesting about this response is hidden power number 3. Steve knew that at the time, taking on Microsoft directly was extremely expensive and probably impossible because of the network effect of the Windows PCs. So instead of fighting a war over PCs, Steve focused on the future. He focused on upcoming trends with consumers, with the industry, new trends in technology, and he found a new opportunity, a new place to compete. And he had done it before, right? At this point, he had done it with Pixar. He had done it with Next, which later became OS X. And sure enough, 2 years after he said this, he released the iPod. And then shortly after that, he released the iPhone. And now, today, over 70% of internet devices are mobile phones. Something that he was able to take advantage by riding the waves of new technologies and new trends. I like that picture there. I think that's a great metaphor there of somebody riding that wave. So here's what's striking. Everything that Steve did was business 101. It was even obvious, but here's the important part. Despite this, what Steve did was totally unanticipated by business analysts at the time. Everyone thought that the solution for Apple was in strategic alliances, advanced products, licensing technology and brands, and other complicated commercial bullshit. But Steve did none of that. He didn't announce ambitious revenue goals. He didn't announce ambitious profit goals. He didn't even announce a grand vision for the future. He didn't cut Apple blindly either. He simplified, focused the company around a small product line that let Apple survive. And it did survive, right? And now Apple's one of the biggest, most valuable companies on the planet. That leads me to hidden power number 4, probably one of my favorite hidden powers in situation. Just having a strategy. What's interesting is that organizations and people don't typically have strategies at all, nor do they even take time to reflect on what their plan or what their strategy should be. They just go on autopilot. That happens to all of us, right? Most of us are guilty of just being on autopilot for our careers and for what we want in life. It's pretty common. What's really cool about this, though, is that it's a major advantage to just have a strategy written down. Any strategy. Doesn't matter if it's good or not, just write it down. And here's what's really interesting also is that people don't expect you to have one. So that's an advantage, an imbalance that favors you. Just write it down and you've got an immediate hidden power. I love that one. More examples. Here's one of my favorite stories. One of the first NASA moon missions was to land a probe on the surface of the moon. No one knew what the surface of the moon was like. Was it a bunch of sharp needles pointing everywhere? Was it large boulders? Was it powder? If you landed a probe there or a human there, would you sink into the powder? So was the environment so harsh that it damages anything and everything that lands on it? Phyllis Buwalda, she's the woman on the right-hand side there. She was in charge of creating a model for the lunar surface. And what I like about her is that she was actually homeschooled. She was homeschooled on a ranch, but she was described as as being a very tough woman with a very hard, sharp intellect that was great at getting to the root cause of things. So very cool person. Her model described the surface of the moon as hard, grainy, scattered with small stones, and small boulders, maybe half a meter apart, kind of spread out everywhere. At the time that she introduced this model, a young engineer asked her, "Phyllis, this description of the moon looks like the US Southwest." And she replied, "Yeah, it does, doesn't it?" Well, the young engineer then replied, "But Phyllis, you don't really know what the moon is like. Why are we writing a specification for the engineers when we don't know for sure?" And so Phyllis responds, "Well, this is what the smooth parts of the Earth look like. So it's probably a pretty good guess as to what the moon is like if we stay away from the mountains." And the engineer replies, "But you don't really know. It could be powder, it could be needles." And she replies, "Look, the engineers can't work without a specification. If it turns out to be a lot more difficult than this, then we aren't going to be spending much time on the moon anyway." So here's the thing. The truth is that at the time, nobody knew what the moon was like. What she did was to strategically choose an objective to make progress on a bigger idea. Here's her big insight. If the surface of the moon didn't support a straightforward lander, then this wasn't an engineering design problem. Actually, in this case, the entire US space program was in deep trouble. So the impact of her analysis was pretty huge. In fact, you could write a PhD thesis on the options theory that's implicit in her analysis. One of my favorite stories, I love this engineer. She's absolutely great. So that is hidden power number 5, is approximate objective. So choosing objectives that are feasible and valuable, so they're worth doing, but crucially, they resolve ambiguity, right? Because you have this big vision and nobody really knows how to get there, but you can design a smaller problem, one that will help you to make progress, define a new problem that is actually solvable and helps you get closer to your larger goal. Last example, this one's also one of my favorites, and then I will open it up for questions or comments. So in the 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union were in a Cold War. And at the beginning of the space race, the Soviet Union's rocket technology was actually significantly more advanced than the United States. In fact, the Soviet Union was on the verge of placing small space stations with people on them in orbit. This was obviously completely unacceptable to the United States because, among a bunch of other things, the Cold War was a competition over the imagination of the world. And the US desperately needed to be the leader, or wanted to be the leader in space, but also in the minds of people's imagination all over the world. Capitalism over communism. So what did NASA do to finally win the space race that they were actually behind, that they were actually losing? They chose a proximate objective. In 1962, John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, announced the Apollo moon landing program. And many people, when they think about, that quote of this speech, we choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Everybody kind of remembers this was a grand, inspiring vision, but actually, of course, it was that, but actually it was a very, very strategic choice. It was a very strategic proximate objective. So here's the thing. Landing on the moon required rockets that were 10 times as big as any other rocket that had ever been designed at the time. Both countries would have to start over, developing new rocket technology from the beginning. And so although the United States was behind, the strategic choice here and the strategic bet was that if the two countries had to start from scratch, new rocket programs from the beginning, then the US was at an advantage because it had more resources to start from scratch. And so then the attention shifted away from manned space orbits and manned space stations to putting somebody on the moon, redefining a new problem, a problem that the US felt they could win. And of course, the US won the space race, placing a person on the moon in 1969 during the Apollo 11 space mission. So just to repeat, a casual observer might think that John F. Kennedy's 1962 announcement of the moon landing was just an inspirational challenge. But actually, it framed a carefully chosen asymmetric competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Pretty clever. So, recap of all these tools. So when you're forming your plan and you're looking for hidden power, remember these 4 concepts that are often sources of hidden power. So here's a quick recap. Number 1, advantage. Your plan should focus on decisive asymmetries. Discover imbalances in a situation that favors one party or another. Use them to your advantage. Limit the things that you do to just the things that you can do better than others. You don't have to, and then finally, the next one is dynamics. You don't have to reinvent the world. If you don't have the resources, then be patient and observant and watch for the trends in technology, in people, in culture, in fashion, whatever it is, and use those trends to introduce something new and use them to your advantage. Finally, and if you can take just one thing from this talk, it's this last one. Just have a strategy. just write something down. Just think about it. It's a superpower. Most organizations, most people don't have one, and they don't expect you to have one. So just having one gives you a big advantage. So I didn't come up with all these amazing things. This is one of my favorite books ever. It's a book on strategy, but it is also, if you look at it correctly, a kind of a self-help book for life. It's got 10 more sources of hidden power, so go ahead and check those out. And it covers way more topics. It describes how to structure a good strategy, has lots of examples of bad strategy, which are a lot of fun. Some of them are really hilarious. And then it's got tons and tons of great stories to illustrate the points of what a strategy is and what a strategy is not.